When Padre Pio heard confessions, he would often tremble. Why? Because he saw what others couldn't. This humble saint could read souls and knew immediately which sins separated people from God. Today, I'm revealing the first of the 12 sins Padre Pio insisted must be confessed before receiving Holy Communion. This sin alone keeps millions from receiving grace. But this is just the beginning of what Padre Pio revealed. The other sins he identified are even more shocking, especially the third one, which most priests today are afraid to mention. The first sin Padre Pio insisted must be confessed before receiving Holy Communion is deliberate dishonesty in confession. Padre Pio would often stop penitents mid-confession and say, "You are hiding something from me and from God." He could see when someone intentionally concealed sins out of shame or pride. In one famous account from San Giovanni Rotondo, a businessman traveled all the way from Milan just to confess to Padre Pio. When he entered the confessional before he could speak, Padre Pio said firmly, "You've been dishonest in your past 3 confessions. You've concealed your adulterous relationship. Until you confess this sin truthfully, receiving communion is another sin upon your soul." The man fell to his knees in shock. "How could you know this?" he asked, trembling. Padre Pio replied, "It is not I who knows, but God who sees all." This first sin, hiding or minimizing sins in confession, was so serious to Padre Pio because it transforms the sacrament from medicine into poison. A half confession, he would say, is worse than no confession at all. It adds sacrilege to your existing sins. What makes this particularly dangerous is that many people don't realize they're doing it. They use vague language, downplay the seriousness, or conveniently forget their most shameful acts. Padre Pio could see this deception clearly, even when the penitent had convinced themselves they were being honest. But the second sin that must be confessed is even more widespread in our modern world. This sin has infiltrated nearly every household and corrupts souls silently. Padre Pio would spend hours counseling people to recognize and uproot this sin from their lives. In fact, when Padre Pio was asked which sin was causing the most souls to be lost in the modern era, he pointed to this second sin without hesitation. "It enters through the eyes and corrupts the heart," he warned. "I'll reveal this sin in a moment. But first, let me ask you, if you've ever hidden even a small sin in confession out of embarrassment, leave a comment saying, 'Truth heals.' You're not alone. Studies show over 62% of Catholics admit to being selective in what they confess. But as Padre Pio said, the confession that opens the door to Holy Communion must be as transparent as crystal. Those who follow Padre Pio's guidance on complete confession report profound spiritual transformation. One woman from Portugal wrote that after making a complete confession, following Padre Pio's guidelines, she experienced a lightness of spirit I hadn't felt since childhood. Another man said, "The sin I was most afraid to confess became the key that unlocked God's mercy in my life." But the consequences of ignoring this first warning from Padre Pio? They're severe. He often told people, "Receiving communion while hiding sins is like putting fine wine into a vessel filled with poison. You corrupt the divine gift." Now, about that second sin that Padre Pio insisted must be confessed. The second sin that Padre Pio insisted must be confessed before receiving communion is impurity of the eyes and mind, what we now call pornography and deliberate impure thoughts. Though Padre Pio lived before the internet age, he prophetically warned about images that corrupt the soul. The eyes, he said, are the windows through which sin enters the soul. He would often refuse absolution to those who did not sincerely commit to guarding their eyes from impure images. In 1957, a young man came to Padre Pio for confession. Before he could speak, Padre Pio said, "Those magazines under your bed must be burned." The man was stunned. How could this priest know about the inappropriate magazines he had hidden thousands of miles away? This miraculous knowledge convinced the young man to transform his life. Padre Pio's insight on this matter was extraordinary. He could see the spiritual wounds caused by visual impurity, saying they were like acid that eats away at the soul's capacity to see God. What makes this sin particularly dangerous today is its accessibility and anonymity. What once required effort to find is now available with a single click, making this sin even more prevalent than in Padre Pio's time. The evidence of Padre Pio's spiritual insight on this matter is overwhelming. When a woman from Naples came to confession, Padre Pio told her, "Your house must be cleansed of the impure novels on your bookshelf. They're poisoning your communion with God." She later confirmed that no one could have known about these books, as she'd kept them hidden from everyone. But as serious as these first two sins are, the third sin Padre Pio identified goes deeper and is even more widespread. This sin involves something most people do every single day without recognizing its spiritual danger. In fact, when Padre Pio was asked shortly before his death which sin was most overlooked in confession, he pointed to this third sin. "It masquerades as necessity," he said. "It disguises itself as harmless, but it starves the soul of divine life." One of Padre Pio's most dramatic miracles involved this third sin. A prominent doctor traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo, skeptical of the stigmatic priest. During his confession, Padre Pio suddenly stopped him and described in detail a conversation the doctor had in private just 2 days earlier. A conversation in which the doctor had committed this third sin grievously. The doctor was so shocked by Padre Pio's impossible knowledge that he fell to his knees in the confessional. Now, before I reveal this third crucial sin that must be confessed, consider this. Padre Pio often said that the first two sins, dishonesty in confession and impurity of eyes, were merely symptoms of a deeper spiritual problem. This third sin is the root from which many others grow. The spiritual danger here cannot be overstated. Padre Pio once told his spiritual director, "If the faithful understood the gravity of this third sin, confessionals would be full day and night." He called it the silent killer of spiritual life and the sin that pretends to be a friend. What makes this third sin especially dangerous is that most people, even devout Catholics, don't recognize it as sinful. They've been conditioned by our modern culture to accept it as normal, even necessary. But Padre Pio could see the spiritual damage it caused as clearly as a doctor can see a physical wound. So what is this third sin that Padre Pio insisted must be confessed before receiving Holy Communion? It's something that affects virtually everyone in the modern world, something that has increased exponentially since Padre Pio's time. The third sin Padre Pio insisted must be confessed is attachment to worldly possessions and the sin of greed. The soul cannot fly to God, he would say, when it is weighed down by material things. Padre Pio could discern a person's unhealthy attachments to wealth, possessions, and comfort, attachments most people never think to confess. Consider this shocking story. In 1962, a wealthy businessman came to Padre Pio seeking a blessing for his new enterprise. Instead of blessing him, Padre Pio looked deeply troubled and said, "Your soul is in grave danger. Last night you denied help to a poor family while counting your money in secret." The businessman was stunned. This was true, but how could Padre Pio have known? He had refused help to his own struggling cousin while privately reviewing his substantial assets. This man left without receiving communion that day. "Return when you have detached your heart from your wealth," Padre Pio told him. "Only then will you be ready to receive the Lord." 3 months later, the man returned, having given significantly to the poor and reconciled with his family. Only then did Padre Pio welcome him to the Eucharist. The cost of not recognizing this sin is severe. Padre Pio observed that many souls remained in purgatory specifically because of unconfessed greed and attachment to possessions. They never thought to confess it, he explained, because society praised them for their acquisitions rather than warning them of the spiritual danger. What makes this sin so insidious is that it hides behind respectability. People who would never steal are nonetheless consumed by desire for more comfort, more security, more status symbols. Padre Pio could see how this attachment corrupted their reception of the Eucharist. They make their possessions into idols, he would say, and then try to receive God alongside their idols. But even this third sin pales in comparison to the fourth sin Padre Pio identified. This fourth sin was so serious that Padre Pio revealed it only on his deathbed to his closest associates. This sin, he whispered, has emptied more pews than all persecutions combined. In fact, one of Padre Pio's most dramatic prophecies involved this fourth sin. In 1965, just 3 years before his death, he predicted that this sin would become a plague in the Church, driving souls away from communion in unprecedented numbers. Looking at today's statistics of declining mass attendance, his prophecy has proven tragically accurate. This fourth sin is particularly dangerous because it often appears virtuous on the surface. The devil's greatest trick with this sin, Padre Pio explained, is to make people believe they are defending God when in fact they are driving souls away from him. What makes this revelation even more compelling is that Padre Pio spoke of it only reluctantly. When pressed about why he didn't preach about it more openly, he responded, "Some truths are like strong medicine. They must be administered carefully or they can harm instead of heal." The spiritual consequences of this fourth sin are severe. Padre Pio described a vision he received of souls in purgatory specifically because of this unconfessed sin. "They burn with a particular flame," he said, "the flame of division they kindled on earth." And the fifth sin, that revelation was so controversial that even some of Padre Pio's fellow Capuchins advised him not to speak of it publicly. This fifth sin, one brother later wrote in his memoir, was the one that caused Padre Pio the most grief in the confessional, because those who committed it rarely recognized its gravity. Before I reveal these next crucial sins that must be confessed before receiving Holy Communion, ask yourself this: have you ever thought deeply about your relationship with material possessions? If you've recognized the need to detach from worldly things, comment "freedom" below as a personal commitment to examine this area of your spiritual life. Remember, Padre Pio warned, "The communion rail is not a right but a privilege for souls properly prepared." The next sins he identified cut to the very heart of why so many receive communion but experience so little transformation. The fourth sin that Padre Pio insisted must be confessed before receiving Holy Communion is pride and judgmentalism, particularly spiritual pride that leads to condemning others. This revelation was so controversial that for nearly 50 years, many church authorities were hesitant to emphasize it. Why? Because spiritual pride often disguises itself as righteousness. This sin, Padre Pio would say, is most dangerous in those who consider themselves most devout. He could see how pride corrupted even the most regular communicants, turning the bread of humility into an occasion for self-exaltation. One of the most dramatic examples occurred in 1951, when a prominent religious leader came to San Giovanni Rotondo. Before this person could even enter the confessional, Padre Pio sent word: "Tell him to pray until he can name the 12 people he has judged harshly this week." The visitor was shocked. He had indeed privately criticized 12 fellow clergy members in his thoughts. No one could have known this except through supernatural insight. Padre Pio's stance on this sin was so firm that he would sometimes refuse absolution to those who showed no contrition for their judgmental attitudes. "Your prayers are reaching the ceiling and bouncing back," he told one regular communicant who criticized fellow parishioners. "Until you see others through the eyes of mercy, your reception of communion profanes the sacrament." What makes this sin especially dangerous is that it often increases with religious practice rather than decreasing. Those most devoted to external observances can become the most condemning of others who fall short. Padre Pio saw how this spiritual poison spread through religious communities, turning the Eucharist, the sacrament of unity, into a badge of superiority. This revelation caused such controversy that in 1960, when asked by a visiting bishop why he spoke so strongly about this sin, Padre Pio replied, "Because it is the sin most communicants refuse to recognize in themselves. They confess all manner of lesser faults, while this cancer grows unchecked in their souls." And a woman named Sophia from Athens shared a life-changing encounter with Padre Pio regarding this sin. Having traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo, she was eager to receive communion from the stigmatic priest. But in the confessional, Padre Pio said, "First, tell me about the contempt you hold for your neighbor." Stunned, she realized he knew about her bitter feelings toward a family member. Only after sincerely confessing this judgmental attitude did Padre Pio allow her to approach communion. But as serious as spiritual pride is, the fifth sin Padre Pio identified is even more insidious. This fifth sin is so deeply embedded in modern life that most people never think to confess it. It is the sin, Padre Pio said, that demons fear discussing the most, because once a soul recognizes it, true conversion often follows. This fifth sin relates directly to our relationship with God and with others. It undermines every attempt at spiritual growth and neutralizes the graces of communion. Padre Pio called it the sin that makes the host fall like rain on desert sand, leaving no fruit. Incredibly, when Padre Pio spoke of this fifth sin in the confessional, many penitents reported feeling a physical sensation, a heaviness on their chest that lifted only when they acknowledged this sin in their lives. One man described it as scales falling from my spiritual eyes, allowing me to see myself truthfully for the first time. This fifth sin is the one that demons most fear people will confess, because it strikes at the very foundation of their power over souls. The fifth sin that Padre Pio insisted must be confessed is failing to forgive others. Unforgiveness, he would say, makes communion sterile. It is like trying to fill a cup with a hole in the bottom. Padre Pio could see unforgiveness lodged in hearts like spiritual shrapnel, preventing the healing graces of the Eucharist from taking effect. In 1956, a woman came to Padre Pio in deep spiritual distress. She had been receiving communion daily for years, but felt no spiritual growth. Before she could explain her situation, Padre Pio said, "Your brother's name is Marco, and you have not spoken to him in 8 years. Go and reconcile with him before returning to this confessional." The woman nearly fainted. No one in that region knew about her estrangement from her brother in America. What makes unforgiveness particularly serious before communion is the direct connection to Jesus' teaching. If you bring your gift to the altar and there recall that your brother has anything against you, leave your gift at the altar, go first to be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Padre Pio took these words literally, sometimes telling people to postpone communion until they had made peace with others. The hidden wounds of unforgiveness affect not just individuals, but entire communities. Padre Pio could trace parish divisions, family dysfunctions, and personal spiritual stagnation to unconfessed unforgiveness. Some people, he observed, receive communion for decades while carrying the same grudges. Then they wonder why they experience no transformation. Now let's connect all 5 sins that Padre Pio said must be confessed before receiving Holy Communion. Dishonesty in confession, hiding or minimizing sins, impurity of eyes and mind, especially regarding pornography and deliberately impure thoughts, attachment to worldly possessions and greed, pride and judgmentalism toward others, unforgiveness, and harboring resentments. These 5 sins form a kind of spiritual chain, each reinforcing the others. Pride makes us hide sins in confession and judge others harshly. Attachment to worldly things often leads to impurity as we seek comfort in the wrong places. unforgiveness is sustained by pride and prevents us from experiencing God's mercy fully. Padre Pio offered a specific method for breaking this chain. Examine your conscience on these 5 points before every communion, he advised. Even a brief but honest assessment will prepare your soul to receive the Lord fruitfully. Under those who have followed this guidance report, profound changes. One man wrote, "After confessing years of hidden resentment toward my father, I felt the Eucharist truly enter my heart for the first time." A woman testified, "Once I acknowledged my spiritual pride, communion became less about my worthiness and more about God's mercy." If you've recognized any of these 5 sins in your life and are committed to confessing them before your next communion, leave a comment saying, "Mercy prevails." Join the community of those who are seeking authentic spiritual transformation through Padre Pio's guidance. But these 5 sins are only the beginning of Padre Pio's revelations. The 6th sin he identified is perhaps the most relevant to our modern culture, a sin so widespread that it has become nearly invisible to most believers. This sin particularly grieved Padre Pio because he saw how it gradually emptied churches and weakened faith across generations. When one of his spiritual children asked why this 6th sin was so serious, Padre Pio replied, "Because it turns the medicine of the Eucharist into mere ritual, draining it of power in the soul." This sin directly contradicts the purpose of communion, which is transformation into Christ. What makes this 6th sin especially dangerous is that it can affect even those who carefully avoid the previous 5 sins. A person might confess perfectly, Padre Pio observed, yet still commit this 6th sin on the very way to receive communion. The spiritual consequences are severe. Padre Pio described seeing souls in his mystical visions who had received communion thousands of times, yet remained spiritually immature because of this unrecognized 6th sin. The 6th sin, Padre Pio insisted must be confessed, is receiving communion without real faith and reverence, approaching the altar out of habit rather than hunger for God. Some come to communion as if approaching ordinary bread, he lamented. Their bodies kneel, but their souls stand proudly. Maria Campanile, who knew Padre Pio for over 20 years, shared this account. Once during Mass, Padre Pio suddenly stopped distributing communion and began to weep. Later he explained that he could see people receiving the host mechanically, their thoughts wandering to worldly concerns, while the King of Heaven entered their bodies unnoticed and unwelcomed. This sin of irreverence and spiritual carelessness troubled Padre Pio deeply because he himself could see Christ truly present in the Eucharist. Witnesses reported that during consecration, Padre Pio often engaged in visible dialogue with Jesus, present in the host. His face would transform, sometimes radiating light that others could perceive. What makes this sin particularly dangerous in our time is the erosion of Eucharistic faith. Studies show that a significant percentage of Catholics no longer believe in the real presence. Padre Pio predicted this crisis, saying in 1965, "A time is coming when many will approach the Lord's table without trembling, without awe. Routine will replace reverence, and the graces will fall unabsorbed." The transformation that occurs when this sin is recognized and confessed can be immediate and profound. One priest shared this testimony. "After hearing Padre Pio speak about reverence in receiving communion, I confessed my years of routine celebrations. The very next Mass I celebrated was like my first. I could hardly hold back tears at the consecration. Now let me tell you what you can expect in the first 48 hours after confessing these first 6 sins sincerely. First, many report a heightened awareness of Christ's presence, not just in the Eucharist, but throughout their daily lives. It's as if a spiritual cataract has been removed, one woman explained. I suddenly see God's hand everywhere. Second, difficulties in prayer often dissolve. People who previously struggled to focus during prayer describe experiencing new depth and intimacy with God. One man said, "After confessing my habitual irreverence, my next communion felt like a reunion with a beloved friend rather than a religious obligation." Third, relationships begin to heal. As the graces of worthy communion flow into your life, you'll likely find yourself becoming more patient, more understanding, and more willing to forgive others. Family members often notice the change before you do, but there's still something crucial missing from this picture. These 6 sins identified by Padre Pio reveal obstacles to fruitful communion, but there's an activating element needed to experience the full power of the Eucharist. As Padre Pio told a spiritual daughter just months before his death, confession removes obstacles, but something more is needed to make the soul receptive. Without this additional element, even a soul free from serious sin may gain little from communion. This missing element is what distinguishes those who are merely regular communicants from those who are transformed by the Eucharist. Padre Pio called it the key that unlocks the treasure chest of communion. In fact, the next 3 sins Padre Pio identified are directly connected to this activating element. They reveal how subtle spiritual failures can neutralize the power of the Eucharist in our lives even after sincere confession. The 7th sin is particularly relevant to our distracted age. Padre Pio saw this sin increasing as the pace of life accelerated. Modern life, he predicted, will make this sin nearly universal, choking the seed of the Eucharist before it can bear fruit. But what makes this revelation so important is that it connects directly to Jesus' own words about receiving him worthily. This sin undermines the very purpose of communion, which is union with Christ and transformation into his likeness. Those who have confessed and overcome this 7th sin report dramatic spiritual growth. One businessman wrote, "After addressing this specific issue in confession following Padre Pio's guidance, my experience of communion changed completely. What was once a brief ritual became the centerpiece of my spiritual life and the source of strength for every challenge." But the key to unlocking the full power of these revelations lies in understanding the specific ritual that Padre Pio taught his spiritual children. The 7th sin that Padre Pio insisted must be confessed is distraction and haste, particularly before and after receiving communion. The moments before and after receiving the Lord, he taught, are the most precious of our earthly life. To waste them is to spill the divine nectar before it can be absorbed. Padre Pio prescribed a specific ritual of preparation and thanksgiving that transforms the communion experience. Without this ritual, he warned, even a soul free from serious sin receives only a fraction of available grace. Here's the ritual Padre Pio himself practiced and taught to his spiritual children. Before Mass begins, spend at least 10 minutes in silent preparation. Padre Pio would enter a state of deep recollection, often appearing oblivious to the bustling activity around him. "Imagine yourself at Calvary," he advised, "for the same sacrifice will be made present at the altar." During the consecration, Padre Pio recommended a specific prayer focus. Look not at the priest, but through him to Christ who acts through him. He taught that our attitude during these sacred moments either magnifies or diminishes the fruits of communion. The most critical moments are the 3 minutes immediately after receiving the host. Padre Pio would become completely still, his eyes closed, his face transfigured. In these moments, he explained, Jesus is physically present within you. The angels surround you in adoration. All of heaven watches how you welcome its king. One of Padre Pio's spiritual daughters, Cleonice Morcaldi, recorded his specific guidance. After receiving communion, close your eyes and mouth. Let no one and nothing distract you. Imagine your soul as a throne room where the King of Kings has just entered. Offer him your problems, your plans, your loved ones. Listen for his voice in the silence of your heart. The exact prayer Padre Pio recommended for the moment after communion was this: Lord, I am not worthy to have received you, but I surrender everything to you. My thoughts, my actions, my desires, make me entirely yours. He insisted this prayer be said with complete focus, not as a rushed formula. For those who follow this ritual with sincerity, the transformation can begin immediately. One skeptical professor who adopted Padre Pio's method testified, "After 3 communions, following his guidance, I experienced such profound peace that my colleagues asked what had changed in my life." But there's a specific schedule for this ritual that Padre Pio considered optimal. He taught that spiritual preparation should begin the evening before receiving communion. As you prepare your clothes for tomorrow, also prepare your soul, he advised. This preparation includes examining your conscience regarding the first 6 sins we've discussed and making a sincere act of contrition. The morning of communion should begin with what Padre Pio called sacred silence, at least 5 minutes without media, phone conversations, or worldly discussions. This silence, he explained, creates space in the soul for the divine guest to enter. Without this ritual, the 5 places are just decoration, meaning that avoiding the sins we've discussed is necessary but not sufficient. The ritual activation is what transforms knowledge into experience, turning the Eucharist from a religious observance into a life-changing encounter. Padre Pio was so convinced of this ritual's importance that he once told a bishop if the faithful would practice proper preparation and thanksgiving for just 1 month, we would see a renewal that no pastoral program could achieve in years. What makes this ritual particularly powerful is its simplicity. It requires no special knowledge, no elaborate prayers, only focused attention and sincere devotion. Yet few implement it consistently because the 8th sin, which we'll discuss next, creates a powerful resistance to this practice. This 8th sin is so prevalent in our modern world that Padre Pio predicted it would become the great destroyer of souls in the latter times. He saw how it would infiltrate even the lives of devout believers, gradually eroding their Eucharistic faith and practice. When a spiritual director asked Padre Pio why so few experience the full fruits of communion despite regular reception, he pointed to this 8th sin and said, "It is the chain that binds the modern soul, preventing flight toward God." The danger of this 8th sin is its subtlety. Most people never confess it because they don't recognize it as sinful. Yet Padre Pio could see how dramatically it hindered spiritual growth, especially in relation to the Eucharist. But before revealing this 8th critical sin, I must emphasize, if you commit to practicing Padre Pio's communion ritual for even 3 consecutive Sundays, leave a comment saying 3 Sundays as your pledge. Those who have tried this experiment report astonishing results that begin to manifest by the 3rd week. The 8th sin, Padre Pio insisted must be confessed, is spiritual sloth and lukewarmness, a lack of fervor in the spiritual life. God spits the lukewarm from his mouth, Padre Pio would warn, quoting the Book of Revelation. Better to be cold than lukewarm, for at least the cold person recognizes their condition. This spiritual tepidity particularly concerned Padre Pio in his later years. In 1962, he shared a prophetic warning with his close associates. A time is coming when many will approach the altar daily, yet remain spiritually stagnant for years. They will mistake routine for devotion, familiarity for intimacy. What makes spiritual lukewarmness especially dangerous is its progressive nature. Like a spiritual anesthetic, it numbs the soul gradually. Padre Pio described seeing souls in the confessional who had imperceptibly declined from fervor to formality to mere habit. The lukewarm soul, he explained, is like someone who takes powerful medicine without following the doctor's instructions. The medicine is present but cannot heal because it is not properly received. One dramatic example occurred with a priest who visited San Giovanni Rotondo regularly. One day, Padre Pio refused to speak with him. Through an intermediary, he sent this message: "Tell Father his masses have become routine performances. His words are hollow because his heart is elsewhere. Until he confesses his lukewarmness, I have nothing to say to him." The priest later acknowledged that he had been mechanically going through the motions of his priesthood for years. This confrontation led to profound conversion and renewed zeal in his ministry. The urgency of addressing this sin is greater now than ever before. Padre Pio prophesied specific challenges our generation would face. In the coming age, distractions will multiply. Souls will be bombarded by stimulation. Many will receive communion while their minds race with worldly concerns. They must confess this divided heart, or the bread of life will lie dormant within them. This prophecy has proven remarkably accurate. In our age of smartphones and constant connectivity, cultivating the sacred attention Padre Pio described is increasingly difficult. Many approach communion with minds still processing emails, social media, and to-do lists. The protection against spiritual lukewarmness that Padre Pio recommended was sincere confession, followed by concrete acts of devotion. Confess not only that you have been lukewarm, he advised, but commit to specific practices that will rekindle fervor. For those experiencing spiritual dryness, Padre Pio offered this consolation. Dryness is not the same as lukewarmness. In dryness, the soul suffers from God's seeming absence, but still seeks him earnestly. In lukewarmness, the soul is comfortable without deep communion with God. Ndil, the spiritual protection Padre Pio recommended against this eighth sin, was surprisingly specific. He advised confessing lukewarmness explicitly and then making what he called a heroic commitment, choosing one small but consistent spiritual practice as an antidote to tepidity. For some, this might be setting aside exactly 10 minutes each day for focused prayer without distractions. For others, it might be a weekly hour of Eucharistic adoration or regular spiritual reading. The specific practice matters less than the commitment to fight against the gradual cooling of love. Those who have followed this guidance report remarkable transformation. A businessman from Milan shared, "After confessing my spiritual lukewarmness and committing to just 7 minutes of focused prayer each morning, I began experiencing God's presence throughout my day. Problems that once overwhelmed me now seem manageable because I sense God working with me." The ninth sin Padre Pio identified is directly connected to this eighth sin, forming what he called the final barrier to Eucharistic transformation. This ninth sin is particularly relevant for long-time believers who may have grown comfortable in their faith journey. What makes this ninth sin especially dangerous is that it often disguises itself as wisdom or prudence. Many confess it only when directly confronted by a wise spiritual director who can see through their self-deception. If you're committed to addressing the sin of lukewarmness in your spiritual life before your next communion, comment "protected" below. This public commitment itself becomes a shield against the enemy's attacks on your Eucharistic devotion. Now, let me share Padre Pio's urgent warning for our times. During the last years of his life, Padre Pio became increasingly concerned about how receiving communion unworthily would affect the Church and the world. A time is coming, he prophesied in 1962, when sacrilegious communions will wound the Church more deeply than external persecution. He explained that when large numbers of people receive Christ in the Eucharist without proper preparation, confession, and reverence, a kind of spiritual darkness descends over entire communities. It is not only an individual sin, he insisted, but one that affects the entire body of Christ. This is why the sins we've discussed are so critical to confess. They are not merely personal failings, but wounds that affect the Church as a whole. Padre Pio could see this spiritual reality with supernatural clarity. Where others saw only individuals, he saw the mystical connections between souls and how unworthiness in one member impacts all. The urgency of heeding Padre Pio's guidance has never been greater. Recent studies show that mass attendance and belief in the real presence have declined dramatically in recent decades. Padre Pio predicted precisely this crisis, connecting it directly to the spread of the sins we've been discussing. When these sins go unconfessed, he warned, the light of faith gradually dims, not only in individuals, but in entire nations. Looking at the spiritual landscape today, his prophecy has proven tragically accurate, but there is hope. Those who follow Padre Pio's guidance on worthy communion become beacons of authentic faith, radiating grace to those around them. As one of his spiritual sons testified, "When I began confessing the sins Padre Pio identified and receiving communion according to his method, not only did my life change, but I noticed others around me being drawn to a deeper faith." The protection of souls depends on this message spreading. If you recognize the importance of these revelations, comment protegido if you'll adopt Padre Pio's guidance starting today. The ninth sin that Padre Pio insisted must be confessed before receiving Holy Communion is lack of charity and compassion for others. How can you receive the God who is love, he would ask, while your heart remains closed to your neighbor's needs? Padre Pio could see the direct connection between how we treat others and how we receive Christ in the Eucharist. He often told people, the host you receive and your neighbor in need are the same Christ in different forms. Your treatment of one affects your reception of the other. One striking example involved a wealthy woman who complained that she felt nothing during communion despite frequent reception. Padre Pio shocked her by saying, "There are 3 homeless families in your neighborhood whom you pass daily. Your blindness to Christ in them has made you blind to Christ in the host." This ninth sin is particularly insidious because it can coexist with external religiosity. Padre Pio observed many people who were scrupulous about liturgical rules, yet callous toward human suffering. Such people, he said, strain gnats but swallow camels. They receive Christ's body while ignoring his teachings. The 10th sin Padre Pio identified is nursing bitterness and complaints. The complaining soul, he explained, is like a cup already filled with vinegar. When the sweet wine of Christ's presence is poured in, it turns bitter. Padre Pio could see how habitual negativity and constant criticism poisoned the Eucharistic experience. In the confessional, he would often surprise penitents by asking, "How many times did you complain yesterday?" Most were shocked to realize how pervasive this habit had become. One businessman calculated later that he had voiced over 30 complaints in a single day, poisoning his outlook and relationships. The remedy Padre Pio prescribed was specific: confess the sin of complaining explicitly, then practice gratitude deliberately, noting 5 gifts from God each morning before facing the day's challenges. Those who followed this guidance reported not only spiritual benefits, but also improvements in physical health and relationships. The 11th sin is breaking promises to God, making commitments in prayer that we later abandon. Padre Pio saw how casually people made promises during moments of fervor or crisis. "Lord, if you help me with this problem, I'll pray the rosary daily," or "I'll attend Mass more frequently," or "I'll give more to charity." God takes these promises seriously, Padre Pio warned, even when we forget them. He advised people to write down any commitments made to God and review them regularly. Before communion, he suggested asking, "Have I kept my word to the Lord who now comes to me?" One businessman experienced this dramatically when Padre Pio refused him communion, saying, "First, fulfill the promise you made 3 years ago when your daughter was ill." The man had completely forgotten his vow to support an orphanage if his child recovered, a promise he had indeed neglected after her healing. The 12th and final sin Padre Pio insisted must be confessed is ingratitude for the Eucharist itself, taking this supreme gift for granted. If angels could receive communion, he often said. They would approach the altar with such reverence that most humans would be ashamed of their casualness. Padre Pio could see communion with mystical sight. Witnesses reported that during the consecration, his face would transform as he beheld Christ present on the altar. Sometimes he would weep, overwhelmed by the miracle unfolding before him. Other times, he would appear to converse with someone invisible to others. This 12th sin, ingratitude for the Eucharist, encompasses and magnifies all the previous sins. When we truly appreciate what happens in communion, we naturally want to remove every obstacle to receiving its full benefits. Padre Pio's promise to those who confess these 12 sins and approach communion worthily is both simple and profound. You will experience heaven on earth. The problems that once overwhelmed you will find their proper perspective. Decisions that confused you will become clear. Relationships that were broken will find healing. Your life will become a living testimony that attracts others to Christ. But there's one final mystery that Padre Pio revealed only to his closest associates. He said, "The soul who cleanses itself of these 12 sins and receives communion worthily discovers a 13th reality that I cannot explain. It can only be experienced." Those who reported this experience described it as a foretaste of heaven and Christ living in me in a tangible way. This final mystery reveals itself only to those who put these teachings into practice consistently. As Padre Pio said, some truths cannot be told, they can only be lived. Indeed, if this message has touched your heart and you intend to confess these sins before your next communion, leave a simple Amen in the comments. Join the community of those who are rediscovering the transformative power of the Eucharist through the wisdom of this remarkable saint. Remember Padre Pio's final words on this subject. Worthy communion can change not only your life, but the world around you. Every soul that receives Christ fully becomes a channel of grace for countless others.